4 American hydrogen bombs crashed onto the ice in Greenland. It happened in 1968, 7 miles from an American airbase, on sea ice, in the dead of the polar winter. There was no nuclear explosion, but each of those 4 bombs was roughly 100 times the power of Hiroshima, and when they hit the ice, their conventional explosives went off and blew them apart. Then came a frantic, freezing cleanup, and when it was over, one piece of one bomb was still missing. The Americans sent a secret submarine down to look for it. It found nothing. And back in Copenhagen, this accident would eventually expose a secret that Denmark had been keeping from its own people for 40 years. To understand why an armed bomber was circling the top of the world, you have to understand what everyone was afraid of. For years, America had kept nuclear-armed B-52s in the air around the clock, so a surprise Soviet attack could never catch them all on the ground. Up in Greenland sat one of the most important radar stations on Earth. Thule's early warning radar was built to spot Soviet missiles coming over the pole, America's few minutes of warning before a nuclear strike. So the Air Force flew a special mission called Hardhead. One bomber, always in the air near Thule, keeping eyes on that radar, so that if it ever went silent, America would know whether it was a glitch or the first move of a war. Here's the thing though, by 1968, the man in charge of the Pentagon had been trying to kill this program for 2 years. The radar was built, the missiles had made the flying bombers redundant, and keeping them up cost over $100 million a year. The generals had pushed to keep a handful of them airborne anyway. On the day of the crash, just 4 nuclear-armed bombers were in the air anywhere on Earth, and one of them was about to go down. On the 21st of January, a B-52 called Hobo 28 was flying the Thule loop with 7 men and 4 hydrogen bombs aboard. It had been in the air for hours, and the chill was getting into the cabin. Before takeoff, one of the pilots had stuffed some cloth-covered foam cushions over a hot air vent to sit on. Then, to warm the freezing cabin, the crew ran extra hot engine air into it. About 6 hours in, the vent overheated and the cushions caught fire. Fire spread fast and killed the electrical power. They couldn't make it back to the base. The commander gave the order to bail out. 6 men got out and survived the Arctic night. The 7th, co-pilot Leonard Sviatenko, had earlier given his ejection seat to a spare pilot, so he had to jump through a lower hatch, and he was killed. The empty bomber flew on for a few more minutes, then dived into the sea ice at around 600 miles an hour. 4 hydrogen bombs hit the ice at once. The conventional explosives inside all 4 detonated, but not one of them went nuclear. The safety systems did exactly what they were built to do and prevented a chain reaction. These bombs were designed so that even a violent accident, a crash, a fire, their own explosives going off, could not set off the nuclear stage. On the ice at Thule, that design held. It was the one thing that went right. What they did instead was quieter, and in its own way, worse. Right. The blast tore the bombs apart and threw plutonium, uranium and tritium across the ice, a black scar of burned fuel and radioactive debris stretching for more than a mile. And beneath it all was the sea. The burning wreckage melted down into the ice, and some of the contamination went through it into the water below. Exactly how much was never fully accounted for. And all of this was happening in one of the most remote places a person can stand. 700 miles from the North Pole, in the permanent dark of the Arctic winter, with the nearest help hours away. The cleanup was one of the strangest operations of the Cold War. They called it Project Crested Ice. The men who did it had a darker name for it, Dr. Freezelove. They worked in the Arctic night, in cold that fell to 75 below, in winds strong enough to knock a man off his feet. Crews walked the ice 50 abreast and scraped up every piece of contaminated snow they could find. More than 200,000 cubic feet of radioactive ice, snow and debris, and 500,000 gallons of contaminated water and fuel were loaded into steel tanks and shipped back to the United States. They estimated they'd recovered around 90% of it. The rest they could not get back. And there was a bigger problem, one they kept quiet. When they pieced the weapons back together, they could account for the cause of only 3 of the 4 bombs. So that summer, under the cover story of a science survey, the Navy quietly sent a small research submarine, borrowed from an oceanography institute in California, down into the fjord to search the seabed for the missing piece. It crept along the bottom in the dark, its lights barely reaching, and made 11 dives. It found no weapon parts at all. Decades later, the Danish government commissioned scientists to settle what that missing piece actually was. Their answer: not a bomb. All 4 bombs were destroyed. What was never found was a single component, the uranium core of one bomb's hydrogen stage, a metal cylinder about the size of a beer keg. As far as the record shows, it is still somewhere under the ice of that fjord. The morning after the crash, America cancelled the whole Airborne alert program. 2 nuclear bomber accidents in 2 years was enough. But in Denmark, the accident raised a much more uncomfortable question, because there were American hydrogen bombs over Greenland at all, and Denmark had a proud public policy: no nuclear weapons on Danish soil ever in peacetime. Greenland was Danish territory. So how were there 4 hydrogen bombs on the ice? The answer sat in a letter, hidden for almost 40 years. Back in 1957, Denmark's Prime Minister, H.C. Hansen, had quietly written to the American ambassador, signalling that if the US had nuclear weapons at Thule, he did not want to be told and had nothing further to add. The Americans took it exactly as it was meant: permission. Don't ask, don't tell. When this finally leaked in 1995, the scandal had a name: Thulegate. An official Danish inquiry then confirmed what ministers had denied for years. The United States had actually stored nuclear weapons at Thule, not just flown them over until 1965. Denmark's own foreign minister had told the public that weapons were only ever in Greenland's airspace, never on its soil. The inquiry proved him wrong. The country that told its people it was nuclear free had been hosting American bombs the whole time. There is one more group this story never really finished with: the men who did the scraping. Hundreds of Danish workers had spent that winter out on the contaminated ice, often with little protection, loading radioactive snow by hand. Years later, many of them got sick. A Danish study found cancer rates among the Thule workers running around 40% higher than expected, though it could not prove the radiation was to blame. A survey of 1,500 of them, taken in 1995, counted 410 already dead of cancer. They took the United States to court and lost, but the lawsuit pried hundreds of secret documents into the open. In the end, the Danish government paid its own workers 50,000 kroner, each a few $1,000s. And as late as 2007, the European Parliament was still ordering Denmark to give these men the medical monitoring they'd been promised and never fully got. 4 hydrogen bombs fell on the ice of Greenland. The bombs were destroyed. Most of the plutonium was scraped up and shipped away, but a piece of one is still down there in the dark water. The men who cleared the ice were left to fight for what it cost them, and the secret that put those bombs there in the first place stayed buried for 40 years, right up until the ice gave it back.